So let's talk about dyslexia. So in this video, we will discuss the following points. The first point will be, what is dyslexia? And the second point will be to look at the awareness of dyslexia, and in understanding this, we will be looking at a specific timeline. And the third point will be to briefly discuss dyslexia and intelligence. And finally, in the fourth point, we will discuss the gift of dyslexia, which in this context will be dyslexia and entrepreneurship. So let's analyze this train of thought and begin this journey. Okay, so how are we going to start this? Where do we begin? Because there are so many questions to ask. But the first question to me is obvious. What is dyslexia? So to answer this question, let's turn to the British Dyslexic Association. Quote, dyslexia is a learning difficulty that primarily affects the skills involved in accurate and fluent word reading and spelling. End of quote. And there are additional issues to this, such as issues in verbal memory, verbal processing speed, and phonological awareness. Now I was thinking, what is phonological awareness? Now I had to research this, because to me it's one of those topics where you think you know it, but you don't know it. So let's break it down into three phases. Phase 1, counting syllables in words. Shakespeare, now that has 2 syllables. Pugnacious, that has 3 syllables. You get the point. And phase 2 is identifying rhyming words. So let's give an example. Nerds, verbs, birds, they are words that rhyme. Cat, mat, flat. Again, these are words that rhyme. And finally, phase 3, recognizing alliterations. You can do alliterations in a variety of ways. You could do alliterations with the B sound. So here's an example I found on the internet. Quote, Janie read a book by the babbling brook. End of quote. And I really do love alliterations. So it's important to notice that when we talk about dyslexia and we're talking about the phonological awareness, what we're speaking about is a 3-phase definition of the struggling of counting syllables, identifying rhyming words, and recognizing alliterations. So I think that part of dyslexia is not as understood as the other part of dyslexia. And let me clarify that just because someone with dyslexia may struggle in these areas, that doesn't mean that they can't grasp these concepts or even excel in these ideas. So for example, you might have someone, let's say John, and John has dyslexia, but that doesn't mean that John won't be able to count syllables. That doesn't mean that they won't be able to identify rhyming words, and that doesn't mean that they won't be able to, to recognize alliterations. All it means is that initially they may have barriers in this area, but with the appropriate training, going back to our John example, John may become an alliterations specialist. And just to further the example, Sally might have dyslexia, but that doesn't mean that they can't develop their verbal processing speed and develop high phonological awareness. Now this raises some other questions, and an interesting question would be, when was dyslexia discovered? And when was dyslexia being discussed? Of course we could develop those questions to where was it discovered in terms of what regions was it discussed, but I don't want to go down that specific rabbit hole. And when I was looking into dyslexia, there were some dates that stood out to me, and those dates was 1877, 1900 and 1971. So let's get into that and let's explain that. So dyslexia was first being discussed in 1877. So that's significant. That's when there was discussions on dyslexia. And in 1900, at this time, they were using what I would call non-political terms to define dyslexia, such as word blindness. I guess different politics, different time. I mean, language can have positive and negative connotations, or positive and negative denotations. but I don't want to digress too much. Anyway, so dyslexia was seen in the following context, quote, a deficiency of the visual memory for words, end of quote. Now in 1971, there was a lot of research into dyslexia, and the definition of dyslexia here is pretty standard. So we have phase 1, issues with reading, and phase 2, this is not related to behavior and it's not related to intelligence. And I think that's really crucial. It's not related to behavior and it's not related to intelligence. Now, why is this interesting? It's an interesting point because dyslexia does not negatively affect intelligence. So there's no relationship between dyslexia and intelligence with regards to it being negatively affected. And from what I can gather, this was a very objective view. This wasn't a political standpoint where people were saying, okay, we have to see this in a more positive light. They objectively looked at this and came to that conclusion that intelligence doesn't affect dyslexia. So what does that mean? It means people that have dyslexia have the potential to have high intelligence, meaning that they can have high IQs. So what we should never do is look at someone that has dyslexia and assume that they would have low intelligence, because that premise would be completely incorrect. And of course, intelligence is a completely subjective variable, and there's different parts of intelligence. There's mathematical intelligence, there's logical intelligence, there's existential intelligence. So the next thing I want to discuss is this concept of dyslexia being a gift. Now, when I talk about gift, I'm talking about natural ability or talent. So let's put that in context. So Shakespeare clearly had a talent with words. Einstein clearly had a talent with science. George Foreman had a talent with boxing. And Jean-Michel Basquiat had a talent with art. So we're talking about a talent as opposed to giving someone something. So what is the gift or the natural talent of dyslexia? That's a good question. It's a compelling question. And the answer appears, or one of the answers would suggest, that people with dyslexia do really well in entrepreneurship, which would lead to another question. Why do people with dyslexia do well in entrepreneurship? Well, there's an article by Kate Griggs, a dyslexia thinking expert, which attempts to answer this question. Now, this article gives 5 reasons to why people with dyslexia are successful. So the first reason is that they think differently. And the argument here is that improved visualization and logical properties. I like this concept of connecting neurodiversity to positive characteristics, because seeing neurodiversity as a superpower is motivational as opposed to just seeing barriers. So I like this, and the concept of people having dyslexia thinking differently and that different way of thinking benefits them, that makes sense to me. Reason number 2, they keep it simple. Now, if you keep it simple, you lessen something called decision fatigue. Because if you overthink a decision, there is, ironically, more decision fatigue. Let's give an example. So in the game of football, there is something called a penalty. Now, if you go up to take a penalty and you're thinking, should I shoot the ball left? Should I shoot the ball right? Should I hit it high? Should I hit it low? Should I hit it hard? Should I hit it soft? That, to me, is a case of decision fatigue. So the implication here is that the person with dyslexia can make those decisions without experiencing decision fatigue. Reason number 3, people with dyslexia are great storytellers. Because dyslexic people see the world in a visual way, this enhances their visual storytelling ability. And of course, storytelling is a very important part of human interaction. We can tell stories about love, hate, philosophy. And this offers the journey which can affect one psychologically in a positive and in a negative way. Reason number 4, they are passionate and curious. Now, curiosity in the right context is not a bad thing, and passion is an important and essential thing if put in the right place. Now, passion in the wrong business That's a very dark place. But passion and curiosity in the right business, now that's empowering. And finally, reason number 3, dyslexia are people. This means, I think, that they can connect with others in an effective way. So another way of saying this is that people with dyslexia can have effective social intelligence. And effective social intelligence is very important, particularly in the world of entrepreneurship. What I like about this article is that it's motivational, and it's also, as stated earlier, it's looking at neurodiversity in a positive way. It's identifying that there's almost like a power to neurodiversity. It's not just about the barriers. And I think that this is an encouraging way to look at neurodiversity. So the following is some concluding points. Point number 1, dyslexia is a learning difficulty, and it primarily affects reading and writing, but there are other complex issues such as phonological awareness. Point number 2, we did mention 3 different dates, but in particular, in 1971, there was a lot of research in dyslexia. Clearly they defined dyslexia, but they also ascertained that dyslexia does not affect intelligence. And finally, point number 3, the gift of dyslexia appears to be entrepreneurship. And there is actually a book with this title, The Gift of Dyslexia. And I haven't read the book yet, but I do intend to. Anyway, the gift of dyslexia appears to be the gift of entrepreneurship. And Kate Griggs breaks this down into 5 phases. And they think differently, they keep it simple, they're great storytellers, they're passionate and curious, and they are people, which means that they have great social intelligence. And let me just put that that's my interpretation of that final point. Anyway, with that being said, I sincerely hope that this video has provided value.